In this video, I'm going to take us to the next step of the PyVC protocol, actually doing the risk assessment. So on the map, this is our third step. The first thing we need to do is set ourselves up for success, and that's what I will discuss in this first section. So in this session, I'm going to talk about getting ourselves ready for the assessment. We are going to collect all of our data into a workspace. Historically, this has been a set of spreadsheets. We could insert our infrastructure elements down the column here. We insert the climate parameters that we've developed earlier here. And we also transfer the likelihood scores that we received from the climate team here. The first thing we need to consider is that these workspaces can get to be very large, especially if we have a lot of climate parameters, infrastructure elements we're considering leading to a lot of potential interactions, and if we're looking at multiple time horizons. So we need to scope our assessment carefully to ensure that we do not balloon the assessment to an unmanageable extent. Now, as I said, historically, we've been using worksheets to do this sort of data gathering. However, there has been a growing trend to use databases, especially with very large assessments and with large portfolios of assessments that we may wish to consider. When you're setting this up, one of the things we need to think about is, are we going to use worksheets or database? It can be very difficult to make the transition midstream. So the key points to take away from this are elements, climate parameters, and likelihood scores are inserted into a workspace. Worksheets can get to be very large, and we may use a database if necessary. In part 2, I'm going to discuss exposure analysis. This session covers exposure analysis, its purpose, the approach that we take to it, and what we expect to see as outcomes from exposure analysis. So why do we do it? We do it because we want to screen the interactions that we're considering and eliminate unaffected elements. So we want to focus on relevant interactions. Those are interactions where there is actually an exposure. Do individual components see the climate event? Performance response analysis can inform this. In performance response analysis, we're already thinking about how climate hazards can affect specific parts of the system. So we've already got a sense of where there may or may not be exposure. And in this stage, we formalize that analysis. This is often a facilitated exercise. Likely do it at a workshop, and we'll gather participants from different disciplines because we want to gather different perspectives on where the exposures may or may not occur. And this requires some professional judgment. In the process, we start with the infrastructure list. For each climate parameter, we would consider, would this element see that climate event? Could impacts occur in one or more infrastructure response categories? We want to identify elements that may be affected by a climate hazard and screen out those elements that are not. This will reduce our workload later. And now just a few more words about words. In the protocol, we use the term yes-no analysis for exposure analysis. Does it see it? Yes. Does it not see it? No. But this is not a common practice in risk management. Normally, the vocabulary used in risk management is exposure analysis. PyVC yes-no analysis is directly equivalent to exposure analysis, and that aligns with risk standards. If you want to learn more about this sort of analysis, however, the keywords to look up are exposure analysis. The key points to take away from this are exposure analysis is an important phase of the assessment. It's used to screen out unaffected elements, and it's a standard risk management activity. In part 3, we consider the actual consequence analysis. So this session will cover consequence scoring considerations, and the effect of risk appetite on that consequence scoring. So we score consequence as if the event does occur. We disregard the likelihood and we assume the event has already happened. So we need to think about our performance response analysis here, possible climate interactions, the elements that are exposed, potential cumulative and combined events that may affect things, what sort of uncertainties we have in all of this, and why particular scores are chosen, documenting our rationale as we go along. Assigning consequence scores is an informed decision based on professional judgment. We either develop these independently and validate them at a workshop, or do the entire development within the workshop setting. The protocol suggests a 5-point scale, but as always, users may use any scale that they deem to be appropriate for their work, as long as they document their reasons why. So here is a typical 5-point scale from PyVC. There are 3 different things that we're considering here. The score, its classification in terms of low, very low, moderate, etc. A description of what those things may mean. Very low to no consequence, measurable impacts, that sort of language. And a definition based on the owner's criteria, which we developed in our performance response analysis. So we have clearly indicated what 1 means, 2 means, 3 means, etc., as we go into our consequence analysis. Risk appetite can have an effect on consequences. Score definitions depend on our risk appetite, what constitutes a serious loss, and this varies from organization to organization. The protocol allows for adjustments of scoring scales based on risk appetite. That's one of the things we are doing when we're doing our performance response analysis. And this can have a significant impact on our assessment outcomes. So we need to pay attention to what those scores actually mean and the effect it may have on our ultimate risk profile. So risk appetite can affect consequence. In this chart, I'm using dollars because it's CCDC quantitative results and how they apply to each other. But we can see how as an organization's risk appetite changes across the scale, the definitions of what is significant or minor varies. So if, for example, looking at insignificant, for one organization, they were talking about something less than $5,000, another less than $50,000, another less than $500,000 worth of impact. These are not the same, but the approach that we're using can be used in any of these sorts of organizations as long as we understand that the consequence scoring represents the appetite of that organization. Consequence scoring depends on our perspectives. Effective workshop will consider all sorts of different perspectives from different professionals, different stakeholders at the table. And we try to assign a representative score that takes all of that into consideration. And this may take a bit of negotiation. So here, consider a culvert failure that occurred in Toronto a number of years back. There were major impacts. Major independent stakeholders and services were affected. So when we're looking at this, how do we consider consequence? Are we talking about the service to the public or the effect on operations directly? Safety of the public, safety to operations, socioeconomic impacts in the short and long term? So we need to think about how we would score this from the various perspectives of the various people at the table. This helps us develop a robust risk profile. So how does the arithmetic work here? Here we have our consequence and scoring criteria that we've developed earlier. We establish a likelihood of 2 for a particular event, a consequence of 5 for that same event. So the risk calculated within the PyVC protocol would be a 10. That is, likelihood times consequence equals 10 for those items that are exposed. We use a heat map to describe what this all means in terms of risk priorities. And we have 2 special cases that we think about. Typically, those items that score a 5 require a bit more thought than some of the others. So these are the special cases. In one case, we have very low likelihood and very high consequence. Think of something like a tornado or a hurricane, which can be very impactful but quite rare. So it's a low risk or a medium risk according to the assessment, but it could be potentially catastrophic. So we need to think about these things carefully. It may require no action. On the other hand, it may require some sort of emergency response preparation to deal with the consequences when they occur. So we think about these things in a little bit more detail and do not simply accept that it's a 5 and therefore we don't need to worry about it. Similarly, when we have a very high likelihood but with a very low consequence, can have same sorts of thought considerations going on. For example, this is potentially low or a medium risk, but it could have a big long-term impact. It's sort of a creeping risk that just grows over time. And it requires, once again, some careful review. We may not need to do anything, but we may need to adjust our maintenance plan and our budgeting to accommodate these sorts of creeping risk. So we think about actions and priorities that come out of all of this. So low risk, we would typically screen out for further analysis. We're saying, for now, these are not of concern. Medium risk may need some longer term action. We may consider budgets and the uncertainties associated with those events. High medium risk may be sensitive to the assumptions and scoring. So it could be, depending on how we scored consequence or likelihood, creep down into medium or creep up into a high risk. So we tend to pay a little of attention as to what were our assumptions and what are the sensitivities around these risks. But if they lean more to the medium risk, we would treat them as a medium risk category. And if they lean more to the high risk, we would tend to treat them as a higher risk. So that one we need to think about a bit as well. For high risk, no further risk assessment is required. We know that action is required. We know it's a priority now. So it will be transferred to a risk treatment team. People will look at what sort of alternatives do we have for dealing with this particular risk profile. In action, we return to our workspace and we enter our consequence scoring within the workspace. And there we get the arithmetic happening and we end up with a range of scores for the interactions. Everything comes together in consequence analysis. It draws on the expertise of our team. We need to consider various perspectives, and we use the risk profile that we develop to prioritize further action.